Sebastian Ashford did not want to be at Pemberton Manor, and the fact that he was standing in the entrance hall of it, with his valet's luggage being carried past him, and Edmund Pemberton grinning like a man who had won a long-running bet, was not improving his mood in the slightest. He had turned down the first invitation. He had turned down the second. The third had arrived on a Tuesday, when the rain had been falling for 4 consecutive days, and his London house had become the kind of quiet that was indistinguishable from waiting for something. And he had folded the letter, told Alfred to have George pack, and set out with the particular expression of a man heading towards something he suspected he needed, but would very much have preferred not to. The journey from London had taken 6 hours. The roads through Berkshire were in a terrible condition. By the time the carriage rolled up the gravel drive of Pemberton Manor, Sebastian had read a full history of Northern land rights, and had made no progress whatsoever on the question of why he had agreed to come. Edmund met him at the front steps. They shook hands. Edmund looked at Sebastian's face, and said nothing about what he saw there, which was one of the several things Sebastian valued most about Edmund Pemberton. "You look like the journey disagreed with you," Edmund said. "The roads through Berkshire are a disgrace," Sebastian said. "They were a disgrace last year too. Come in. Caroline has been reorganizing the dining seating for 2 days to find somewhere suitable for you." "She shouldn't have bothered," Sebastian said. "She knows that," Edmund said, and opened the door. The house was full. It was always full at these August gatherings. Edmund kept it that way deliberately, on the theory that enough people in the right rooms would eventually find something useful to say to one another. 30 guests, distributed across a week that began on Monday and ended when it ended, and a program of dinners and outings and quiet country mornings designed to make the whole thing feel like rest rather than performance. Sebastian had attended for 5 consecutive years. He had found it, on balance, the least disagreeable social obligation in his calendar. He was introduced, and reintroduced, to perhaps 20 people in the first hour, and managed all of it, with the smooth competence of a man who had been doing this since he was 17. He remembered names. He asked the right questions. He smiled at the right times, and when the right time to leave had arrived, he excused himself to his room, under the pretense of unpacking, and did not come back down for 2 hours. His room was in the East Wing, which he preferred, because the East Wing was quieter. George arrived with the luggage, and began unpacking, with the practiced silence of a valet, who had learned long ago not to speak unless spoken to. Sebastian went to the window. Below him, the south lawn was spread out in the last of the afternoon light. Guests moved in pairs and small groups across the garden, conducting the quiet commerce of social connection that these gatherings were built for. Near the fountain, 3 children were chasing each other, with a focused energy that suggested some very specific and serious purpose Sebastian could not identify from this distance. The smallest of the 3, a boy of perhaps 5, round-cheeked and remarkably fast, was gaining ground on an older girl, who was very clearly running slower than she was capable of, making room for him to catch up. Behind them both, an older boy watched with his arms crossed. He was 10 or thereabouts. He wore the expression of someone who considered himself too old for the game, but was not quite old enough to commit fully to the performance of indifference. Sebastian watched the small boy fall down hard on the grass. There was a pause. The boy sat where he had landed, looked at the ground for a moment, and then stood up and ran again without changing his expression. He had made his decision about the fall before he hit the ground. Sebastian turned away from the window. He dressed for the evening without thinking much about it, and went down. The ball was Edmund's longest evening, the centerpiece of the week. The musicians he hired from London were excellent. The room was lit at the right level. Sebastian danced twice, once with Caroline, which courtesy required, and once with a Lady Elaine from somewhere in Shropshire, who had very kind eyes, and was not his problem. He positioned himself near the east door at 10 o'clock, and stood with a glass, and watched the room, and thought about when he could reasonably leave. Edmund appeared at his shoulder. "You look like a man waiting for a train," Edmund said. "I look like a man attending a party, which is what I came to do." "There's a difference." Edmund handed him a fresh glass. "There's someone I'd like to introduce you to. A Lady Eleanor Whitmore. She arrived on Wednesday. 3 children, widowed 2 years ago. She's—" "Edmund," Sebastian said. "I was going to say she's very interesting." "You have been saying that for 4 years, about 4 different women," Sebastian said. "I appreciate the effort. The answer is the same." Edmund put his hands in his pockets, with the easy manner of a man who was done pushing for the moment. "I'll be at the fireplace," he said, and drifted into the crowd. Sebastian stood at the east door for another quarter hour. The room was warm, and the music had been going for 2 hours, and his patience for the whole enterprise had reached its natural limit. He set down his glass, and went through the east door into the garden. The contrast was immediate. Cool air, open sky, the sound of the party reduced to something faint and manageable behind him. He walked to the far end of the terrace, where an old stone balustrade looked out over the lower garden, and sat down, and the night settled around him like something he had been waiting for. He was not alone. He understood this a full minute after sitting, when the particular quality of the stillness at the other end of the balustrade changed from empty to occupied. A woman was standing there with her back to him, looking out over the lower garden. She was very still, the way a person is still when they are working through something in their mind and have no energy to spare for movement. He might have retreated, the thought occurred to him. He stayed where he was, because the terrace was nobody's private property, and retreating would have made him feel foolish. She turned a moment later, not because she had heard him, but because she was ready to turn, and saw him. He saw the small, efficient reorganization that crossed her face, the quick collection of herself. He recognized it, because he had made the same adjustment. "Good evening," she said. Her voice was calm, and dry, and entirely unsurprised. "Good evening," he said. He stood, a moment later than he should have, and bowed. "Sebastian Ashford." "Eleanor Whitmore," she said. She dipped her head, and added nothing else. They stood for a moment in the way of two people who have both used the same escape route, and are deciding whether to be embarrassed about it. Then she came to sit at the other end of the bench, leaving the correct amount of space, and they both looked out at the lower garden without speaking. The music from the house reached them at this distance as something shapeless, just rhythm and air, all the detail worn away. It was not unpleasant. "Edmund mentioned you," she said. "He mentioned you as well," Sebastian said. She was quiet for a moment. He heard something in that quiet, a small recognition and a tiredness. "He mentioned us to each other," she said. "He means well by it." "He always means well," she said. "It's one of the genuinely good things about Edmund. His intentions are irreproachable." A pause. "He introduced me at dinner on Wednesday to a Lord Harrington, with exactly the same expression on his face. Lord Harrington was very pleasant. He talked about his pheasant shoot for 35 minutes. Something in Sebastian's chest moved. He contained it. "The lower garden," she said after a moment, looking out, "is better than the upper." Edmund would disagree. He spent considerably more money on the roses. "The roses are beautiful," she said. "They're also the most obvious thing out there. The lower garden has an old apple tree that's half dead and leans at a very determined angle to the right. I find that more interesting." "Why?" She considered it, which he appreciated. She was not answering him reflexively. "Because it survived something. I don't know what. A storm, a dry year, something that should have ended it. And it's still here, still leaning, still producing apples in September. There's more worth in that than in a perfect rose." Sebastian looked out toward the lower garden. He could just make out the shape of the apple tree in the dark. They sat in that garden for 2 hours. The conversation moved from the apple tree to the business of estate management, which she knew more about than most people he met at these gatherings. It moved to books, and then to the quality of silence in the countryside versus London, and then to something he had seen on the Scottish moors 5 years ago that had stayed with him, and which he found, in the middle of describing it, that he had never told anyone before. She listened the way good people listen. Actually, not in the waiting sense. She asked questions that required him to think before answering. She offered things of her own with the measured quality of someone who was testing the ground carefully, which he understood because he was doing exactly the same. By the time they stood to go inside, the lanterns had burned considerably shorter. He walked her to the east door. She thanked him, in the voice she had used at the beginning. Calm, correct, but it was warmer now. She knew he noticed. He stayed in the garden after she had gone. He stood at the balustrade and looked at the dark lower garden for a long time, and the feeling sitting in him was not the reckless, frightening thing he remembered from his early 30s. It was quieter than that, stiller, and that, he thought, was what made it worth examining very carefully indeed. He was 38 years old. He had built his life around one lesson, that moving too fast on a feeling that felt certain was the most expensive mistake a careful man could make. 7 years ago he had asked Lady Agnes Fairfax to marry him, slowly and methodically, and with what he believed was complete certainty, and she had accepted. And 11 months later, she had announced her engagement to the Earl of Renly at a dinner in Chester that Sebastian attended. He had sat 3 seats away. He had eaten his dinner. He had talked about drainage to the man on his left. He had gone home and sat alone until 4 in the morning, and decided, very quietly, that he was done allowing himself to be that exposed. He had kept that decision for 5 years. He had been contented, in the way of someone who has organized their life to prevent pain. Contented was not the same as happy, but it was his, and it was stable, and he had come to value it the way you value things you have chosen deliberately. The trouble with Eleanor Whitmore was that she had sat with him in a garden for 2 hours, and had not tried to be anything other than exactly what she was. She had not performed warmth or mystery, or the particular brightness women were expected to bring to these occasions. She had simply talked with him, honestly and without agenda, and he had been more interested in those 2 hours than in anything that had happened to him in 5 years. He went inside. He climbed the stairs. George was asleep in the dressing room. Sebastian sat on the edge of his bed with his jacket still on, and looked at the wall and thought, with the methodical honesty he tried to apply to important things, that he was going to have to be very careful. He was, he already suspected, not going to be careful enough. Sebastian woke on Saturday morning with the awareness that something had shifted overnight, and he lay in the pale early light and examined this with the careful attention he brought to everything that surprised him. The feeling was not complicated. It was simply there, settled in his chest, like something that had decided to stay, and it had the quality of warmth rather than alarm, which was itself interesting, because warmth was what he had spent 5 years keeping at arm's length. He dressed without waking George, and went down to the breakfast room early, when only 3 other guests had found their way downstairs. He ate. He read the morning paper. He was civil to a Mr. Clarence Webb on his left, who trained horses in Gloucestershire, and had detailed opinions about morning light on south-facing paddocks. And Sebastian listened, and contributed, and found the conversation genuinely interesting, because horses were something he knew, and something he could talk about without performing. By the time the breakfast room had filled to the noise of a full gathering morning, Sebastian had eaten and was ready to move. He went out the side entrance and walked toward the stables, not because he had a specific purpose there. He simply preferred, when his mind was occupied, to have somewhere to walk. He heard the children before he reached the stable door. The sound coming from the second box was an argument, conducted with the mutual certainty of 2 people who were both entirely sure they were right. Sebastian entered the stable corridor and stopped. All 3 of Eleanor's children were near the paddock gate, looking at a roan mare. The older boy, James, he remembered from breakfast the previous week when he had introduced himself with great seriousness, was making a detailed statement about bloodlines. He spoke with the authority of someone who had done considerable reading and was confident in what he had found. The girl, Charlotte, 8 years old, was watching him with the particular expression of a doctor waiting for a patient to finish describing the wrong symptoms before correcting them. The small boy was sitting on the top rail of the gate with his legs dangling, studying a beetle on the post beside him. He was paying no attention to the argument whatsoever. None of them noticed Sebastian. James reached the end of his assessment. Charlotte said, without preamble, "You have it backwards. Her dam's line is where the consistency comes from. Her sire has the speed. You said consistency, but you meant speed." "I meant both," James said. "You said consistency," Charlotte said, with the patience of someone who was going to be accurate at the cost of everything else. Sebastian walked forward. All 3 children turned. James straightened immediately, the natural response of a boy who had been taught that adults require certain adjustments. Charlotte looked at Sebastian directly, with clear and completely unsentimental eyes. The small boy looked at Sebastian, looked at the beetle, and looked back at Sebastian. "Good morning," Sebastian said. James introduced himself and held out his hand. Sebastian shook it with the gravity the moment seemed to call for. Charlotte said her name plainly. The small boy said, from the gate rail, "The beetle has 6 legs. All beetles have 6 legs. Papa told me." "That's true," Sebastian said. "Papa knew things about beetles," Henry said, with the informational tone of someone making sure the record was complete, and returned to the beetle. Sebastian looked at the roan mare. She was a good animal, dark roan, with a clean star. He went to the paddock gate and held out his hand, and she came forward with the easy confidence of a horse that had been treated well. He looked at her stance. Her left front foot was resting very slightly differently from the others. You would miss it if you were not looking for it. Charlotte's right, he said. James was quiet. If it were the hoof itself, she would favor it all the time, Sebastian said. She only favors it when she turns. That's habit. She was trained by someone who did not correct the weight shift early on, and she has been doing it the same way ever since. Charlotte nodded once, with the expression of someone whose position has been confirmed by someone qualified to confirm it. She did not gloat. She simply noted. James said, "Right." He said it cleanly, without sulking, and turned back to look at the mare. Sebastian noted this. A boy who could receive a correction at 10 without making it an argument was a boy who was going to be formidable in 20 years. Henry said, "Up." Sebastian looked down. Henry had climbed off the gate and was standing at his side, looking up with the complete directness of a 5-year-old who has not yet learned that requests can be declined. Sebastian hesitated for a fraction of a second. He looked at James, who offered no guidance. He looked at Charlotte, who was watching the mare and pretending she was not also watching Sebastian, with the peripheral attention of someone cataloging a situation. He reached down and lifted Henry. Henry settled against his side as if this were something they had been doing for years. His small hand found a grip in Sebastian's jacket. His head dropped to Sebastian's shoulder. Within 4 minutes he was asleep. Sebastian stood very still in the stable corridor. James and Charlotte continued examining the mare, with the focused industry of children who are pretending not to be paying attention to something they are in fact watching very carefully. Charlotte's mouth had a particular set to it, not quite a smile, but the expression of someone who is observing something that they intend to think about later. Sebastian held the sleeping child. He had not been prepared for this. He had not been prepared for any of it, not the argument about bloodlines or Charlotte's precision or James's serious handshake. And he was not prepared for the warmth of a small sleeping person against his shoulder, or for what it was doing to the careful, organized interior he had been maintaining for 5 years. Something was happening. He did not have a word for it. It was the very specific sensation of a sealed room being opened from the inside. He carried Henry to a stack of clean, stable blankets in the empty box and set him down. Henry rearranged himself without waking, settling his blanket with the confident efficiency of someone who did this often. Sebastian spent the next hour with James. James had serious questions about estate management, not the questions of a boy performing interest, but the questions of someone who had been reading and thinking and had specific things he needed to understand. They walked the paddock in the morning sun and talked about land, about the responsibility of caring for people who depend on you, about what it means to make decisions for a household when you are the only person in it who can. James listened with the close attention of someone building something in his mind, brick by brick. Charlotte sat on the fence with a book for most of it, occasionally correcting a fact neither of them had gotten quite right, always accurately. At lunch, Sebastian was seated far from Eleanor. He noticed this more than he had expected to. He noticed where she was sitting, and he noticed that he noticed, and the noticing was information he added to the rest of what the morning had given him. She was in conversation with the woman beside her, a discussion he could not hear, but could see was genuine. The way her attention engaged and held. She had, he was coming to understand, a specific quality of presence that was not about beauty, though she was beautiful, and not about social skill, though she had that. It was something simpler. She was entirely in the room she was in. She was not performing being in the room. She was just there, fully, without reservation or display, and the people around her could feel the difference without being able to name it. At dinner that evening he was placed 3 seats from her, close enough to hear her voice when the table was quiet, too far to speak to her directly. He contributed to his own conversations, a man on his left who was interesting about railways, a woman on his right who was interesting about botanical illustration, and he was attentive and present to both, and he was aware the entire time of Eleanor's voice 3 seats away. She laughed once at something, the quick, genuine laugh, rather than the social one, and Sebastian looked up without quite meaning to, and looked back at his plate without quite meaning to do that either. He thought about Agnes, briefly. Agnes had been brilliant in rooms. She had managed them the way conductors manage orchestras, always aware of every instrument, always in control of the sound. It had been dazzling to watch. It had also, he understood only now, been exhausting to be beside. Because Agnes was always performing. And when you are with someone who is always performing, you are always an audience, and an audience cannot rest. Eleanor was not performing. She never seemed to be performing. And the difference sat in him all through the rest of the dinner, and he carried it upstairs with him, and he sat by the window in the dark and looked at it honestly. He was 38 years old. He had made himself contented. He had built a life that was smooth and purposeful, and his own. And he had been grateful for it. And he was finding now, in this quiet room, that contented was a word that required very careful examination. He had been calling it a choice. He was beginning to understand that it had also been a kind of loss, that he had simply agreed to call a choice, because the alternative was admitting what it cost. One conversation, 2 hours in a garden, and one dinner, where he had not even been close enough to speak to her. And already the careful interior he had spent 5 years furnishing was showing him its thin walls. He was not reckless. He had promised himself, at 33, that he would not be reckless again. But there was a difference between recklessness and honesty, and the honest thing, the thing that sitting in the dark of the east wing with the window open required of him, was that he was in trouble. He had been in trouble, in all probability, since he stood at his window on Friday afternoon, and watched a small boy fall down on the lawn, and stand up without complaint, and run. He had just not known it yet. The Pemberton gathering ended on the following Monday morning, in the organized warmth of an ending that everyone was slightly sorry had arrived. Bags were loaded into carriages, and goodbyes were made on the front gravel circle, and 30 people who had spent a week together conducted the specific performance of departures. The warmth was genuine, the efficiency was also genuine, and both existed at the same time, because that is what these occasions require. Sebastian had been ready to leave since Saturday morning. He found Eleanor in the front circle among the general movement of departure. She was standing with Cecily Barton, her closest friend, who was saying something in the quick, particular way of someone completing a thought before an interruption arrives. Henry was beside Eleanor, with his hand in hers, carrying a small matchbox in his other fist. Sebastian knew what was in the matchbox. He crossed the gravel. Eleanor looked up and saw him coming with the calm expression she used when something was unexpected, but not unwelcome. "Lady Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Ashford," she said. They stood for a moment, in the general movement of the morning. The phrase of the occasion, "It was a pleasure, safe journey, until next time," rose, and moved around them like water, around 2 rocks that were standing still. "I hope the journey home is comfortable," he said. It was a perfectly ordinary thing to say. He meant considerably more than it, and he thought she understood this, and he thought she chose to receive only what the words actually said, which was the correct thing to do in a gravel circle full of people. "I hope so too," she said. "James has been talking about the station for 3 days. I expect the train will be the main event of the week." "Henry's beetle," he said. "Did it survive the week?" Henry looked up at the sound of his name, and then at the matchbox. "Albert is fine," he said, with the tone of someone who finds the question slightly unnecessary. "He has holes in the box." "Good," Sebastian said. Henry looked at him for a moment, with the simple judgment of a 5-year-old who has made a decision. "You should come back," he said. "Henry," Eleanor said. "He might," Henry said reasonably. "Some people come back." Sebastian looked at Henry. "Some people do," he said. He said goodbye to Eleanor with the correct formality of the occasion. She said something simple and genuine, and did not add anything extra to it, which was entirely her. He watched her turn toward the carriage with Henry's hand in hers, and Charlotte beside her, and James appearing from somewhere with his straight-backed walk that made him look 30 rather than 10. He was in his own carriage and moving down the drive before he admitted to himself that he had been watching the direction their carriage had gone, long after it was out of sight. The journey to London took 6 hours, and he read for perhaps 40 minutes of them. The rest of the time he looked at the countryside passing, and turned over what the week had given him, with the same careful methodology he used for estate problems and difficult correspondence. The difference was that estate problems had clear variables, and the methodology always produced an answer. This produced nothing useful, only a very clear picture of the woman in the garden, and the children in the stables, and the 8-year-old, who had looked at him and said, Are you certain? His London house was exactly as he had left it. Alfred had kept everything in order. The correspondence was stacked and sorted. The fire in the study was laid. Sebastian stood in the hallway and looked at the house and thought it seemed, in a way he could not have explained to anyone, smaller than it had before. He worked through his correspondence that evening and found it absorbing, which was something to be grateful for. He ate alone. He read until 11 and went to bed and woke at 3 in the morning, thinking about nothing in particular except the apple tree in the lower garden, and the way Eleanor had said, there is more worth in something that survived something than in a perfect rose. He lay in the dark and thought about that for a long time. His solicitor arrived on Tuesday morning with a land question from the north, which they dealt with quickly and well. At the end of the meeting, the solicitor mentioned in the tone of someone covering a minor administrative item that Lord Ashton had been making certain inquiries about the Whitmore estate in Wiltshire. He said it without particular weight. It was a business matter. Sebastian looked up from the papers on his desk. What kind of inquiries? An assessment of the property, the solicitor said. Comparable values in the area. Lord Ashton is a widower, and I understand the interest extends beyond the property itself. Something moved in Sebastian's chest, entirely without his permission. That was not quite any of the emotions he had a name for. He said, in a voice that came out very level, "Thank you. That will be all." He sat for a long time after the solicitor left. He went to his club that evening, which he did twice a week as a matter of routine, and found himself at a table with two men he had known for years, Lord Cecil Holt and a gentleman named Frederick Page. They talked about Parliament, which was genuinely interesting, and then about a proposed new bridge in the east of the city, which was less interesting, but had a good engineering question at its center. Then the conversation moved, as club conversations do when the significant subjects are exhausted, toward the social season just ending. Frederick mentioned having seen Lady Whitmore at a concert in the spring. Pleasant woman, Cecil Holt said. Unfortunate circumstances, though. 3 children. She'll need someone practical. Frederick said, Wiltshire land is solid. There are men who would consider the situation for that alone. Sebastian put his glass down. He said, in the quiet, clear voice he used when he was certain of something. Lady Whitmore does not require analysis from men who have spoken to her at a concert. She is managing her situation considerably better than either of you seem to understand. Both men looked at him. The table was quiet for a moment. The conversation moved on. Sebastian finished his drink and went home. He sat at his writing desk that night with the fire low. He took out a sheet of paper. He wrote to Eleanor, formally at first, correctly, as the occasion required. He asked after the journey, after the children, after the beetle. Then the letter moved, over the course of 3 paragraphs, into something else. He told her that the conversation in the garden had stayed with him. He told her that what she had said about the apple tree had made him think about something in his own life that he had been calling a choice, and was beginning to understand, had also been a cost. He wrote one more paragraph that surprised him with its honesty when he read it back. He folded the letter. He held it. He did not address it for posting. He opened the left-hand drawer of his writing desk and put it inside and closed the drawer. He sat with the drawer closed. He had sat down, intending to send a letter. The difference between a letter you send and a letter you keep in a drawer was something he was not yet ready to resolve, because resolving it meant deciding something, and deciding meant risking something, and 5 years of careful living had trained him to be absolutely certain before he risked anything at all. He went to bed. He did not sleep well. He got up at 6 and worked in his study until Alfred appeared with coffee, and the day resumed its ordinary shape, and he was productive and purposeful and organized, and the drawer stayed closed. 3 weeks after Pemberton, London had pulled itself back into the configuration of the late social season, and Eleanor was moving through it with the practiced navigation she had spent 2 years developing. The autumn events had begun: concert series, gallery exhibitions, afternoon gatherings, dinners, and she attended what was necessary and contributed what was genuine, and left before the evenings became performances of themselves. She was at Lady Harrington's Thursday gathering when she first heard Sylvia Crane speak, and she understood within 4 minutes exactly what Sylvia Crane was. The gathering was 12 women in a beautiful room with excellent tea and a conversational current that moved between topics with the smooth management of a hostess who knew her purpose. Eleanor had been attending this series since the previous year. She found them, on the whole, tolerable. The women were mostly intelligent. The talk was mostly honest. Sylvia Crane was new. She had been in London for 6 months following the death of her husband, who had left her comfortably placed and without impediment. She was 30. Remarkable to look at in the specific way of someone who had decided to make beauty into a professional instrument, and she talked about other people with the smooth, well-sourced specificity of a woman who did a very great deal of careful listening at parties. She mentioned the Duke of Ashford at the 3-minute mark. She mentioned him the way you mention something you have thought about carefully and decided is worth directing attention to, casually, with precision. She said she had seen him at the exhibition of Northern paintings. She said he was very distinguished. She left a particular pause, after distinguished, that every woman in the room was equipped to read. Eleanor drank her tea. 2 conversations away, a Mrs. Agnes Plum asked whether the Duke had been at Pemberton this summer. "He goes every year," someone said. "Was anyone interesting there?" Mrs. Plum asked, with the tone of someone who had already been told the answer and wanted it said aloud. There was a brief and very full pause, in which several pairs of eyes moved briefly in Eleanor's direction and then away. Eleanor looked at her teacup. Sylvia Crane did not look at Eleanor. She said, "I understand it was a very pleasant week," and moved the conversation to the Northern paintings, which she described with genuine and detailed knowledge, and the moment passed. Eleanor noted what Sylvia had done, and how well she had done it, and filed it away with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has learned to register things accurately, without reacting to them visibly. She was home by 4. She sat in the garden despite the October chill, and watched the last of the season's roses, and thought about the tea with the honest clarity that was her particular habit. She was also making a decision about Sebastian, that Sebastian himself had apparently not been consulted on, which said something about Sylvia, and something about how the world worked, and neither observation was new. Cecily came the following morning. She arrived at 10 with the particular energy of someone who has been thinking about something for several days, and has finally decided to say it directly. She came in, sat down, looked at Eleanor across the drawing room, with the frank, loving expression of a woman who was going to deliver something uncomfortable, because she thought it needed delivering, and said, "The talk has started." Eleanor said, "I know. Not yet unkind. But there. People noticed at Pemberton, and now people have noticed that you are both in London, and that both of you were at the Harrington exhibition last week, at the same hour, even though you were not together." Eleanor said, "We were not together." "I know that," Cecily said. "I'm telling you what the room saw, not what happened." Eleanor looked at the window. A cart horse was moving slowly down the street outside, patient and enormous. "I want you to be careful," Cecily said. She said it quietly. All the briskness had gone out of her voice. What was underneath it was simply love, the concerned, slightly frightened kind. "I do not want you to be hurt again, Eleanor. Not in this particular way. A man in his position. The mathematics of the situation." "I know the mathematics," Eleanor said. "I know you do," Cecily said. "I'm just asking you to be careful." Eleanor looked at her friend for a long moment. She thought about the garden at Pemberton, and about a man who had sat with her for 2 hours, and had not tried to be interesting, and had been the most interesting person she had spoken to in 2 years. She thought about the stables, and Henry asleep on a stranger's shoulder, and the stranger not moving. She thought about what Careful had cost her already, over the past 2 years, and what it had given her, and whether those 2 things were in any reasonable balance. She said, "Thank you." They drank their tea, and talked about other things, and Eleanor was grateful for Cecily's ability to do both at once, to say the hard thing, and then let it rest without requiring an answer. The Duchess Margaret's summons to Sebastian arrived on the same week. He went on a Thursday afternoon to the house on Grosvenor Street, and sat in the front drawing room, and had tea with his mother, who was 61, and had never, in his memory, said anything she did not mean. She asked about Pemberton. He told her it was well. She asked about Edmund. He said Edmund was well. She poured the tea herself, which meant the conversation was to be private, and then she put down the pot and looked at him. "Tell me about Lady Whitmore," she said. He told her. He told her simply, and without embellishment. Widowed 2 years, 3 children, very intelligent, entirely herself in every situation he had seen her in. He heard what his voice was doing as he spoke. and he understood that his mother was hearing it too. She said, "You've been thinking about this." He said, "I've been thinking about her." She was quiet. She looked at her tea. Then she said, in a different and quieter register, "I don't want you to be lonely, Sebastian." She said it the way she said things she meant in the deepest sense, without decoration, just the plain fact of it. "I have watched you manage yourself into very careful isolation for 5 years, and I have said nothing because it was yours to manage. But I want to tell you now that I have watched it." He said nothing. She said, "I am also obligated to tell you that a duke who pays public attention to a widow with 3 children and a modest estate will create considerable comment. I am not telling you what to do. I am making sure you have the information." "I have the information," he said. She nodded once. She picked up her tea. She said, "Is there anything to declare at this time?" "No," he said. She looked at him for a moment, with the expression of a woman who has just heard 2 things at once and knows which one is true. She said, "All right." And that was the end of it, because she was that kind of woman. He walked home in the early evening dark with his hands in his pockets, and he thought about what she had said, both parts of it, and he thought about the 5 letters in the left-hand drawer of his writing desk, and about the woman who sat in a garden in August and told him the apple tree was more interesting than the perfect rose. He went home and opened the drawer and added 2 sentences to the letter on top. He closed the drawer and went to dinner. November arrived in London with the cold directness of a season that had decided to stop pretending. The social calendar thinned as it always did in the early winter weeks. The country families reclaimed their houses, and the city settled into a working rhythm that Sebastian found, on most years, something of a relief. This year it gave him too much time to think, and thinking was the one activity that had recently produced more questions than it resolved. He had written 5 letters. All 5 were in the drawer. He had not posted a single one. The habit of adding to them continued regardless. A line here, a paragraph there. Things that occurred to him at odd hours, and which he wrote down because not writing them down made them worse. He was aware, with the honest self-awareness he tried to maintain, that the letters were a kind of holding pattern. He was not ready to act, and he was not willing to stop thinking, and the letters were the space in between. He was riding in Hyde Park on a cold Wednesday morning, which he did 3 times a week because Fletcher needed exercise, and because 30 minutes on horseback was one of the few activities that arranged his mind into something useful. Fletcher was a grey gelding of excellent temperament, who had no opinions about Sebastian's personal difficulties, and was therefore the best possible company. He was moving at an easy canter along the south path when he saw Eleanor. She was walking with all 3 children. Henry was slightly ahead, moving at the rapid, determined pace he used when he had identified something interesting 12 feet further along the path. Charlotte was at Eleanor's side, talking with the continuous focus of someone working through an idea out loud. James was behind them both, hands in pockets, looking at the trees with the expression he wore when he was thinking about something he had not yet decided to say. James saw Sebastian first. He looked at the horse, followed it to its rider, and his expression moved through recognition and a careful consideration, before settling on a particular look at Eleanor, which was the look of a 10-year-old who has noticed something and decided not to be the one to name it. Henry turned. "Sebastian," he announced, at a volume that informed the surrounding park. Sebastian pulled Fletcher up and dismounted. He was in the park. She was in the park. This was simply what happened when 2 people lived in the same city. Eleanor looked at him with the expression she wore for unexpected things that were not unwelcome. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. Henry reached Fletcher before Sebastian had finished the sentence, and was reaching for the horse's nose with the absolute confidence of someone who had made friends with horses at Pemberton and saw no reason why this horse would be different. Fletcher, who had seen everything, stood patiently. They stood on the path in the November morning for 9 minutes. Sebastian counted afterwards, not as measurement, but because the time struck him when he remounted. 9 minutes on a public path with 3 children and a horse as the whole context of the conversation, and it was more direct and more real than anything he had managed in 3 weeks of London social events. She told him about Henry's beetle, Albert, who had been released near the front door by James, who had considered the matchbox an inadequate arrangement, and Henry had been sad about this for 2 days before James had found him a replacement and presented it without ceremony or explanation. which Henry had accepted with complete pragmatism. Sebastian said that sounded right. She said James would be a very good person to have in a crisis. He said he had thought the same. There was a pause in which they both looked at Henry, who was examining Fletcher's bridle with the focused interest of a small engineer. She said, "Are you well?" He said, "Yes." He was, in the ordinary sense. In another sense he was not. But that was a longer conversation, and a public path was not the place for it. She said, "Good." She said it warmly, the way she said things she genuinely meant, and he kept it. He said goodbye to the children, which required saying goodbye to Henry 3 separate times, because Henry kept locating new aspects of the horse that required discussion. He remounted. Eleanor looked up at him. "Take care of yourself," she said, the same words as Pemberton. He was beginning to understand that when Eleanor said something, she said it again, because it was still true. She was not a woman who said things for the shape of them. He rode home. He brushed Fletcher with George's help, which he did sometimes when he needed something physical to do with his thoughts. Then he went inside and stood in the hall for a moment, and then went to the study and looked at the closed drawer and did not open it. He went to dinner. 3 days later he went to a bookshop in Piccadilly for a specific title on Northern Estate drainage that his manager had requested. The estate management section was in the rear of the shop. He was walking toward it when he saw Eleanor in the natural history section, which was adjacent to the novels and nowhere near estate management. She had a book open and was reading the back of it with the focused expression of someone who knew what they wanted and was determining whether this was it. He could have gone directly to estate management. He could have purchased his book and left. The calculation lasted perhaps 2 seconds. He walked to natural history. "The ornithology of Britain," he said, because the shelf she was near had birds at eye level, "is better covered in the 3rd row, on the left. If that's what you're looking for." She turned. The quick reorganization crossed her face again. The one he was beginning to understand was surprise followed immediately by decision, and then she was composed. "Thank you," she said. She looked at him with the directness that was simply her way of looking at people. "What brings you to natural history?" "Nothing," he said. "I came for estate management." She looked at the shelves around them. "This is natural history." "I know," he said. She looked at him for a moment, and then something in her expression did what it had done in the garden. Relaxed, just at the edges, the very slight lowering of the particular guard that 2 years of managing everything alone had built. She turned back to the shelves. They were in the bookshop for 40 minutes. He did not go to estate management. He found that the natural history section had a great deal of interesting material, and that discussing it with Eleanor was the most engaged he had been in any conversation since he left Pemberton. She knew about bird migration, genuinely knew it, from reading rather than performance, and he told her about the seasonal patterns he had observed on the northern estate over the years, and she asked a question that required him to actually stop and think, which was something that did not happen often. She told him something in that bookshop that she offered in the quiet, matter-of-fact tone she used for things that were true, and she was done protecting. That after Thomas died she had performed grief for 6 months with complete care. She had been exactly what the situation required, composed, gracious, appropriately sad without being distressing to be around. And one morning she had looked at herself in the dressing table mirror and thought with perfect clarity, "I will not do this anymore. I will be what I actually am. And whatever that costs me, I will pay it." "It cost you," he said. 3 friendships, she said, and my mother-in-law's approval, which I had never quite secured in any case. "Was it worth it?" he asked. She looked at him. "Entirely," she said, no hesitation. He told her something then. He told her about Agnes, not the full story, not the performance of it, but the conclusion. He said he had believed for years that he was a careful man, and that Chester had shown him the difference between being careful and being organized, and that he had spent 5 years since then being organized about his feelings, rather than honest about them, and was finding now that the two were quite different things. She listened with her book in her hands, and the shop quiet around them in the mid-morning. When he finished, she said, "What are you doing with that understanding now?" He said, "I am less certain about certain things than I was." She nodded, slowly, as if this were a reasonable and even somewhat encouraging place to have arrived. He walked her to her carriage on the pavement outside. The cold had sharpened while they were inside. She said goodbye and looked at him through the carriage window for a moment before the driver moved, and then she was gone. He walked home. He stood in the hall. Alfred appeared and took his hat. Sebastian went to his study. He took out a fresh sheet of paper and dipped his pen and held it there and did not write anything. He put the pen down. He took the paper and wrote one sentence on it. It is becoming difficult to be sensible about this. He put it in the drawer with the others. He sat with his hands flat on the desk. The study was very quiet. The clock on the mantelpiece measured out the minutes with complete indifference to any of this. Lord Philip Harrington's winter ball was the kind of event that accumulated its own pressure in the weeks before it happened. Invitations were watched, arrivals were noted, and the evening itself was expected to justify the anticipation, which it did each year, because Harrington understood, better than almost anyone in London, the mechanics of a room. The musicians were always right. The light was always right. The room was always just warm enough. Sebastian arrived with Edmund, who was in London for the month, and had appeared at Sebastian's door that afternoon, with the cheerful determination of a man, ensuring Sebastian had no opportunity to change his mind. The ballroom was at full brightness when they arrived. 300 people, the music already going, the chandeliers doing exactly what Harrington had paid them to do. Sylvia Crane found Sebastian within 12 minutes. She was in a deep bronze dress that knew its purpose, and she talked about the Northern Paintings exhibition with the genuine, detailed knowledge that he respected, and he was attentive and correct and entirely present, and he was also, underneath all of it, waiting for something he could not have named. Edmund removed Sylvia with the elegant misdirection of someone who had known Sebastian for 20 years and had been watching the situation. He mentioned a painting in the East Corridor that Harrington had acquired. Sylvia accepted this with the grace of a woman who understood exactly what had happened and had decided not to show it. She moved away. Edmund stood beside Sebastian. "You owe me," Edmund said. "I was managing," Sebastian said. "You were managing beautifully," Edmund said. "That's the problem." He looked around the room. "She's here, by the way." Sebastian said, "I know." He had known from the moment Eleanor had come through the main door. She was 20 minutes late, unlike her, and there was something in her face when she arrived that was not quite the composed surface she usually wore. A residue of tension. A tiredness beneath the composure. He had been watching the door. She was in deep blue, the same shade as the August garden. He did not know if she knew. The evening moved. He talked with the men Edmund introduced him to, all of them interesting. He danced with Caroline Pemberton. He positioned himself at various edges of the room as the hours went on, and he watched the room without appearing to watch it, which was a skill he had developed over 15 years of necessary social management. He saw Eleanor move toward the east side of the ballroom at 9 o'clock. She moved the way she always moved when she needed a moment, unhurried, without announcement, finding the quieter edge of things. He saw Gerald Ashton follow her. Ashton was 61, wide-shouldered, gray at the temples, and entirely certain of the impression he made. He had been widowed in the spring, and had since moved through the London season with the settled confidence of a man who had identified what he wanted and was arranging the matter. Sebastian had watched Ashton operate before, and had found him, always, a man whose courtesy was a layer above something that was not courtesy at all. He watched Ashton reach Eleanor's side. He watched the exchange begin. Ashton polished and familiar, Eleanor composed. He watched Eleanor look once toward the main room, a small movement, not rude, but clear enough. She wanted to return to it. Ashton's hand came up in the small gesture of a man continuing a conversation that he had decided was not yet finished. Sebastian moved. He did not hurry. Hurrying through a ballroom creates a scene, and a scene was not what Eleanor needed. He moved with the unhurried, deliberate pace of a man who has decided something and is acting on it, which is entirely different from urgency. He reached Eleanor's side. He said, to Ashton, in a voice that was pleasant in tone and absolutely final in meaning, "Lady Whitmore, I promised Edmund I would introduce you to Lady Pemberton before the evening ended. She has been looking for you. If you'll excuse us, Ashton." Ashton looked at him. The calculation happened in his face. Quick, professional. The calculation of a man who is practical above everything. He made it, and arrived at the only conclusion the situation offered, and said, "Lady Whitmore, we'll speak again," and moved away with the composure of someone choosing to retreat on his own terms. Sebastian and Eleanor stood together for a moment. She looked at him. Past the composure, which had not dropped, he saw gratitude and relief, and, just behind both, a pride that did not want to have needed the relief. He understood the combination precisely. "There is no arrangement with Edmund," she said. "No," he said. "Thank you," she said. "Are you all right?" She considered this honestly, which was how she considered everything. "Yes," she said. Then, "Henry had a fever this evening before I came. Cecily sat with him. He was better by 7, but it has been in my head all evening." "Is he better now?" "Yes. Cecily sent word at 8. He said nothing for a moment. He simply stood beside her in the quiet edge of the ballroom, and she was doing what she always did, gathering herself back, resuming her composure. And he watched it happen, and thought about what it cost her to do that every day, alone, in every room she walked into. After a little while she said, "All right." The small, internal straightening. He walked beside her toward the main room. Cecily appeared at the edge of the dance floor, with wide eyes and the particular expression of a woman who has been watching from across the room, and is going to say precisely nothing. She took Eleanor's hand briefly and gave Sebastian one clear, measuring look, and then began talking to Eleanor about something entirely unrelated, in the way of a good friend who knows when to cover a moment. Later, when the evening was thinning and carriages were being called, Sebastian helped Eleanor into hers at the front of the Harrington house. He held the door. She paused, one foot on the step, and looked at him in the way that was hers, direct, without the usual reserve. "Good night, Sebastian," she said. First name. "Good night, Eleanor," he said. The carriage moved. He stood on the steps. The cold came up from the pavement, and the night sky was clear, and he stood there long enough that Edmund appeared at his shoulder. Edmund said nothing for a moment. Then, "Inside?" "Inside," Sebastian said. They went back in. Sebastian moved through the quieting rooms of the Harrington house, toward the back, toward the library, where the light was still on, but the gathering had moved on. He opened the door. Eleanor was already there. She was near the writing desk, standing rather than sitting, with a book open in her hands that she was not reading. She looked up when he came in, and there was a moment of the same reorganization he had seen at Pemberton: surprise, then decision, then composure. He understood now that what happened between those three things was where Eleanor lived. Most people never made it past the composure to see what was underneath. "I'll go," he said. "I'm sorry." "You don't have to," she said. He came in and closed the door. The library was warm and quietly lit. The fire in the grate was the main source of light. The 2 wall lamps turned low. Harrington's books were arranged with the order of someone who actually used them, not simply owned them. Eleanor put the book down. She looked at him the way she looked at him when they were alone, with the directness she maintained in public, but without the additional layer of public distance. "He was going to say something about the estate," she said. "Ashton." She said it as a simple fact, without heat or injury. "I know he has been making inquiries. My solicitor told me last month." A pause. "It is not unexpected. A widow in my position. People make practical calculations. From a certain angle, it is entirely reasonable." She looked at the fire. "I was simply not prepared for tonight." "Henry's fever," he said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "When Henry is ill, I am always afraid in a way I cannot quite contain. He is 5. He is completely certain the world is fine. And I am always afraid that I will be the one who knows it is not, and that he will find out too soon." He looked at her. He had nothing useful to say to this, which was the truth of it, and he had learned from her, in a roundabout way, that the truth was better than something useful that was not true. He said, "He's well now." "He is well now," she said. She let out a breath. "Tell me something ordinary," she said. "Tell me something that has nothing to do with any of this." He told her about the north, about the estate in the early weeks of November, the way the light came across the moors in the afternoon when it was low and cold, the particular blue of it against the gray stone of the house. He told her about a wall he had repaired last spring that had been standing in its original form since 1703, and about the mason he had hired, who understood old stone the way a doctor understands an old body, by feeling for what was there before. He told her he had stood and watched the wall being repaired for 2 hours, and had found it one of the most satisfying things he had witnessed that year. She listened with the quality of attention that was simply hers. When he finished, she said, "You love that place." "I do," he said. It took me a long time to understand why. I thought it was obligation for years. Then I understood that I had been confusing obligation with belonging, and that they can feel the same for a considerable time before you can tell the difference. She was quiet. The fire settled. Outside the window, the London evening moved on without them, indifferent. She said, "I think about what I am going to tell the children, when they are old enough to ask why their father died and whether it was fair." She said it as something she had been carrying for some time and had now set down on the table between them. "I have decided that the answer to the second part is no, it was not fair, and I will tell them that, because I think they deserve the truth, and because I also think that knowing life can be unfair, and continuing to live it well, is one of the most important things a person can learn." She looked at him. "I think Henry already knows this, which is why I am not afraid for him in the long sense, only in the immediate sense, when he has a fever." He said, "You are raising 3 extraordinary people." "They were extraordinary before I did anything," she said. "I am mostly keeping up." She looked at the fire. He looked at her. The moment moved in the room, and the thing that had been building since August, since the garden, since the stable, since the bookshop and the 9 minutes on the park path, was simply there now, with nothing left to hold it back. "I want to say something to you," he said. She turned and looked at him. "I have thought about you every day since Pemberton," he said. "Not in the reckless way, I know the difference, but consistently, and with the particular quality of thought that means something important is happening, that I should not pretend is not happening." He was looking at her directly. The way he said things he meant. "You sat with me in a garden for 2 hours, and were entirely yourself, without performance, without managing what I thought of you, and I found it more interesting than anything I had encountered in years. I have watched you since then, in public, briefly, in the ways that were possible, and what I have seen is a woman who has lost something enormous, and has rebuilt herself around what remained, and has done so without losing a single thing that makes her who she is. That is not ordinary. That is not something I can look at and be unmoved by." She was very still. He continued, "I know what the situation looks like from the outside. I know what my mother has said, and what the world says, and what the mathematics of our respective positions is understood to produce. I have spent 5 years making decisions based on what things looked like from the outside, and I have been contented as a result. And I am finding that contented and right are 2 entirely different things." She said nothing for a long moment. The library was completely still. The fire cracked. She said, "I want you to know that I think very clearly about what is and is not possible." "I know you do," he said. "A duke does not marry a widow with 3 children." She said it quietly, without drama, in the voice of someone who has looked at a difficult fact long enough to say it without flinching. "This is not what I want to be true. It is what is true. I am telling you this because I think you are a man who respects clarity, and I am also telling you because I have been." She stopped. She said, "I do not want to hope for something that the world has already decided is not available to me. I have already done that with one life. I do not have the resources to do it again." He heard what she was actually saying. Not the words on the surface, the careful, logical statement about social reality, but what was underneath it. The fear, the real, earned, reasonable fear of a woman who had rebuilt herself from nothing and could not afford to lose the ground she was standing on. He was quiet for exactly the right amount of time. Then he said, "Then no duke has met you." He said it in the same voice he used for everything he was certain of, level and clear, without performance or decoration. He said it the way a man corrects an error he has identified beyond any doubt. Eleanor did not move. She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them reached for more words, because what he had said was complete. It was not a speech. It was not a declaration wrapped in the language of romance. It was Sebastian Ashford looking at a flawed premise and correcting it, which was what he did when he was sure. She finally said, very quietly, "That is not a reasonable answer." "No," he said, "it isn't." They sat with that in the warmth and quiet of the library. The fire was the only movement in the room. She said, "I should go home. Henry's fever." "Of course," he said. They moved through the quieting rooms of the Harrington house and out to the front, where the cold air met them, and carriages were being called. He stood at the door of hers. She paused on the step. She said, "Good night, Sebastian." "Good night, Eleanor," he said. The carriage moved. He stood on the Harrington steps in the cold night air and watched it go. He went home, past 1 in the morning. He sat at his writing desk in the dark study, the lamp turned low. He opened the left-hand drawer and took out all 5 letters and the one sentence and read them in order. He had been writing to her for months. He had been writing to her and putting the letters away and reading them back and not sending them and adding to them, and what they said, taken together, was entirely clear. He had been clear for months. He had simply been afraid. He understood the fear. He respected it. He had been hurt at 33 in a way that had cost him considerably, and rebuilding after that had taken the better part of 5 years, and the cost of being wrong again was something he had been unwilling to pay. He put the letters back in the drawer. He took a new sheet of paper and began to write. This letter was different from the others, in a way he could feel as he wrote it. The others had been reaching towards something and pulling back. This one arrived. He wrote what he had said in the library, and what he had not yet said, and he said it in the honest and direct way he said things he meant. When he finished, he read it back once and found it true. He folded it, and addressed the envelope and set it on the corner of the desk where Alfred would find it. He carried the 5 letters and the one sentence to the fireplace. He put them in, one at a time. He watched the paper curl and brighten and go. When they were gone, he sat back in the chair and looked at the grate. And the feeling sitting in him was not the complicated, fractured feeling of someone who has risked something and is afraid. It was simply calm, the specific calm of someone who has been honest, finally, about what is true. Across the city, Eleanor sat at her dressing table, while Nora brushed out her hair. The room was quiet. Nora did not speak when she was not spoken to, which Eleanor had always valued. Eleanor looked at herself in the mirror, for a long time, in the way you look at yourself when something has changed, and you are trying to locate the change. She did not look like a widow. She was not sure what she looked like. She looked like herself, she thought, but her face had something in it that had not been there this morning. Something that was not hope exactly. She was too careful for simple hope, too acquainted with what it cost, but something in that direction, something that had decided, against considerable evidence, to remain. She opened her journal. She wrote, "He corrected me. He said what I told him was simply true was not true. He said it the way he says everything, as if the matter is clear and he is surprised anyone thought otherwise. I believe him. I do not know yet what to do with that, but I believe him." She blew out the candle and lay in the dark, listening to the house. James's breathing through the wall, Mrs. Elton's quiet movement in the kitchen below. She went to Henry's room and stood in the doorway and watched him sleep with his blankets in their usual chaos, his face completely at rest, certain even in sleep that everything was fine. She went back to bed and slept, for the first time in weeks, very well. The letter arrived on Thursday morning with the first post. Eleanor was at breakfast with Charlotte when Mrs. Elton brought the tray. Charlotte looked at the envelope and back at her book, with the deliberate absence of expression that 8-year-old Charlotte produced when she had noticed something and was deciding not to comment on it. Eleanor waited until Charlotte had gone upstairs before she picked it up. She read it at the breakfast table. His handwriting was exactly what she had expected of him. Clean, precise, no wasted space. He asked whether he might call on her, at a time that suited her. He said he wished to say certain things more clearly than he had managed in the Harrington library. He signed it with his first name. She sat with the letter for a long time. Charlotte appeared in the doorway on her way to her reading. She looked at Eleanor. She looked at the letter in Eleanor's hands. She said, with the specific tact of a child who has made an active choice to exercise it, "Are you going to write back?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "Good," said Charlotte, and went to find her book. Eleanor wrote back that afternoon. "Yes," she wrote. "Thursday next at 3, if that suits." He arrived at 3 on the precise minute. She had dressed carefully, in a dark green afternoon dress she had always liked. She was in the drawing room when Mrs. Elton showed him in, and they exchanged the formal greetings of two people who have said something significant to each other in a library and are now, very carefully, deciding what the daylight version of it looks like. He had walked. She could see from the color in his face. Alfred was not with him. He had come without the full machinery of a formal call, and she found she was glad of it. Mrs. Elton brought tea. They drank it, and talked about the children, and about the winter coming, and about a piece in the morning paper about the condition of the river embankment. It was good conversation, real conversation, and it was also not what either of them was really there for, and they both knew it, and the knowledge sat in the room with them without making anything uncomfortable. He left after 40 minutes. At the door he paused, with his hat in his hands, and said, "Thank you for receiving me." "Thank you for coming," she said. He went. She stood in the hall, after Mrs. Elton closed the door, and listened to the house. James appeared at the top of the stairs. He looked down at Eleanor, with the watching expression he had worn since he was 8 years old, the expression of a boy who loved his mother, and paid very close attention to her. He said, "He was here." "Yes," Eleanor said. James thought for a moment. Then he went back to his room. Sebastian walked home with his hands in his pockets, and the particular feeling of someone who has done the correct thing, and is now waiting to understand what the correct thing leads to. He sat in his study that evening and did not write. He looked at the empty drawer. He thought about what he wanted to do, which was entirely clear, and what was holding him back, which he examined honestly, and found to be nothing rational. He was afraid. This was true. He had been afraid before, and it had not protected him from anything, and he suspected it was not protecting him now from anything either. He went to bed. He woke on a Tuesday morning 7 days later, and lay for a moment in the early light, and made a decision. He dressed. He told Alfred he would be back for lunch. He walked. The morning was cold and clear, and the streets of London were busy, with the particular morning energy of a city getting itself started. Sebastian walked at the pace of a man who has somewhere to be, and he turned into Eleanor's street without pausing, because pausing would introduce doubt where he had already resolved the question. He knocked. Mrs. Elton answered. She looked at him with the expression of a woman who has been in service for 30 years and recognizes the shape of a significant moment when it arrives on the front step. She said, "Good morning, Your Grace." He said, "Good morning, Mrs. Elton. Is Lady Whitmore at home?" "She's in the garden, sir, with the children," he said. "I'll go to the garden, if I may." Mrs. Elton looked at him for a full second, a measuring, judging, deciding second, and then said, "Of course," and stood back. He walked through the house and out. The garden was small and contained and full of life, despite the November cold. James was measuring something along the east wall with a length of string, some project whose purpose would probably be explained in his own time, or not at all. Charlotte was at the small iron table with her notebook open, writing with total concentration. Henry was on the grass on his back, looking at the sky with the expression of complete satisfaction he produced, when the world was, from his perspective, doing exactly what it should. Eleanor was on the bench with a book open in her lap that she was not reading. She was looking at her children with the expression she wore when she thought no one was watching, the unguarded one, the one that was entirely love and ordinary happiness, and something that was proud and afraid at the same time. She looked up when he came through the garden door. Henry said, "Sebastian," and sat up with the immediacy of someone who has been waiting, without knowing it, for something exactly like this. James turned from the wall. Charlotte looked up from the notebook. Eleanor stood. Sebastian said, "I'm sorry for coming without warning." Eleanor said, "You're not very sorry." "No," he said, "I'm not." Henry had reached him and was looking up with the complete, uncalculated attention of a 5-year-old making an assessment. "Did you get a dog?" he asked. "Not yet," Sebastian said. Henry accepted this as something to return to and let it rest. Sebastian looked at Eleanor. He looked at her in the direct way that was simply his, and he said what he had come to say. He said it without a speech, and without the formal language that convention would have permitted him to use. He said it in the ordinary voice of something true that did not require ornamentation. He said that he had looked for reasons this was impractical, and had found a number of them, and had then examined what those reasons were actually made of, and found that every one of them was about other people's opinions, and not about anything he himself believed. He said he was not concerned with other people's opinions. He had tried that approach at 33, and it had not protected him from anything. He said he would very much like to marry her, if she would have him. He said he wished to know her children, as well as she would allow. He said he was already genuinely fond of Henry. and that Charlotte was the most precise and interesting 8-year-old he had encountered at any age, and that James was going to be one of the most reliable people anyone had ever known. The garden was completely still. James put his string down. He looked at Sebastian with the particular measured look that was his default for important things. He said, in a serious voice, "Are you certain?" Sebastian looked at him directly. "Yes," he said. James looked at his mother. He looked at Sebastian. He said, "Right," and picked up his string and returned to measuring. Charlotte said, "I'll need to consider it." She opened her notebook and wrote something. She closed it. She said, "Yes." Henry said, "Can we get a dog now?" Eleanor said, "Henry." Henry said, "A small one. For the garden." Eleanor looked at Sebastian. She had been very still through all of it. He saw in her face what he had been watching for, the dropping of the last careful distance, the thing she had been holding in reserve since August, the guard that was not coldness but was the reasonable protection of a woman who had been through loss and could not afford to lose again. It was gone now. What was underneath it was simply her. She said, "Yes." He reached into his jacket pocket. His grandmother's ring, a deep green emerald set in plain gold, chosen by a woman who had no patience for fashion and considerable taste of her own. He held it out. She gave him her hand. He placed the ring on her finger, and it fitted, which he had believed it would, and had not been entirely certain of, and it sat on her hand, as if it had always been meant to be exactly there. Charlotte said, from the iron table, "That is a very good ring." "It was my grandmother's," Sebastian said. Charlotte considered this. She had excellent taste, she said, and returned to her notebook. Eleanor looked at the ring on her hand. She looked at him. Something in her face had opened in a way that had nothing to do with weakness. It was not weakness. It was the specific expression of someone who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has finally, set it down in a place where it will be kept. "Thank you," she said, very quietly. "Thank you," he said. Henry said, "So the dog." The letter to the Duchess Margaret was written that evening, 2 pages, calm and direct and honest. At the end of the second page, Sebastian wrote that he was happy. He had used the word carefully for 5 years, aware of its cost, and unwilling to spend it on something that was not true. He spent it now, without hesitation. The Duchess Margaret's reply arrived the following morning. 2.5 pages, precise and organized. At the end, in the final line, "I am glad," underlined once. He read that line 3 times. Eleanor told Cecily, on Thursday. Cecily arrived at 10, sat down, looked at Eleanor and said, "Tell me." Eleanor showed her the ring. Cecily looked at it for a long time. Then she said, in a voice considerably smaller than her usual one, "I knew it." She cried briefly, efficiently, without embarrassment. Then she composed herself and said, "I absolutely knew it. From the garden at Pemberton, from the morning after, at breakfast." He looked at you across the room, when he thought no one was watching, and I was watching. She looked at the ring again. "Eleanor." "Cecily, are you happy?" Eleanor thought about the question with the care she brought to everything. She thought about the garden in August, and the library in winter, and a Tuesday morning with 3 children looking on, and a ring that fitted as if it had been waiting. She thought about Henry, asking about the dog, and Charlotte saying, "That is a very good ring," and James picking up his string. "Yes," she said. Cecily smiled. "Good," she said. "That is all I need." That evening, Sebastian opened the left-hand drawer of his writing desk, one final time. He took out the 5 old letters, the ones he had never posted, the ones that had been accumulating since August. He held them in his hands for a moment. He carried them to the fireplace and fed them in, one by one. He watched the paper curl and brighten and disappear. When the last one was gone, he sat back in the chair and looked at the fire, and the drawer was empty, and the thing it had been holding was gone, because it did not need to be held anymore. He felt, for the first time in a very long time, that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The wedding was set for September, and the months between the Tuesday proposal and the 14th of September were the fullest months Eleanor had known in 2 years. Not the performed fullness of a social season, not the exhausting fullness of managing everything alone, but the particular fullness of a life that has been rejoined to something, of days that had a shape and a future, of decisions that were made between two people rather than by one person alone. Sebastian came to learn the house, not formally, not as an inspector, but as someone who understood that belonging somewhere takes time and attention, and the willingness to be corrected. He sat with James at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning, and they went over the rooms in Sebastian's London house with the seriousness of a planning meeting. James had opinions. They were specific and well-reasoned. Sebastian took notes, genuinely, and made changes. Charlotte requested access to Sebastian's library at least twice a week. He said yes immediately. She looked at him with the expression she wore when something had gone better than she expected, but she was not going to say so. She then spent the first visit reorganizing one shelf of the library according to a system she explained at length, and Sebastian listened and agreed to maintain the system. And when Charlotte left that afternoon, the arrangement on the shelf was demonstrably better than it had been. Henry came to Sebastian's house on a Thursday with Eleanor for what Henry called the inspection. The inspection involved the kitchen, the back garden, every window seat, and one cupboard under the main stairs that Henry had decided was very important. The back garden was approved. The kitchen had a cook named Mrs. Birch, who gave Henry a piece of cake within 3 minutes of his arrival, which meant she had understood the situation immediately and handled it correctly. The back garden had no dog. Henry mentioned this each time he visited. Sebastian resolved the matter on a Wednesday. He arrived at Eleanor's house in the afternoon with a wicker basket, which Mrs. Elton regarded with the expression of someone who has worked in service for 30 years and is not surprised by anything. Henry came through from the garden at that precise moment. He saw Sebastian. He saw the basket. He stopped. The basket moved. Henry said, "Is that a dog?" Sebastian lifted the lid. The dog was 6 weeks old, golden-furred, and deeply uncertain about baskets and hallways and the large number of people looking at it. It looked at Henry. Henry sat down on the hall floor immediately, bringing himself to the dog's level, and the dog walked out and put its chin on Henry's knee, with the resigned trust of a creature that has made its decision. "Pip," Henry said. "Has he been named?" Sebastian asked. "Pip," Henry said again, with the tone of someone confirming an established fact. Eleanor came in from the garden and stood in the doorway and looked at the scene on the hall floor, and then looked at Sebastian over Henry's head with the expression of a woman who is very fond of a person, and simultaneously, completely clear-eyed about what this development means for the household. "You know," she said, "this dog is going to run everything." "I know," Sebastian said. She laughed. The real laugh, unguarded, unheld, belonging to no performance. He had heard it twice before. He would, he had decided, spend the rest of his life finding reasons to hear it again. Charlotte assessed Pip with the efficient attention she gave everything new. She crouched and let him sniff her hand. She said, "He has calm eyes. That is a good sign." Pip approved of Charlotte. James came in last, looked at the dog and the floor with the face of someone who is not going to show excitement, and sat down next to Henry and began asking Sebastian serious questions about the breed. Sebastian answered them. The hall was loud and warm and entirely full, and Eleanor stood in the middle of it and thought, this is what the house was waiting for. She thought, I was waiting for this. On the morning of the 14th of September, Eleanor sat at her dressing table at 7 o'clock, while Nora put up her hair for the last time, as Eleanor Whitmore. The dress was dove-gray silk, with blush at the cuffs and the hem, a color that was not white and not gray exactly but something between, something that looked forward rather than back. Cecily had suggested it. Eleanor had chosen it. Charlotte came in without knocking at 7:30 and sat on the window seat with her notebook. She sat without speaking for a while, which was unusual for Charlotte. Eleanor let the silence stand. Nora finished and slipped out. Charlotte said, "Are you happy, Mama?" Eleanor looked at her in the mirror. Charlotte was watching with the expression she wore when she wanted the truth, and was going to know immediately whether she had received it. "Very," Eleanor said. Charlotte nodded once, with the quiet satisfaction of a hypothesis confirmed. She opened her notebook and read over what she had written there. The 3 stanzas she had been working on for 2 weeks, which she had not shown to anyone, and which Eleanor would not ask to see until Charlotte chose to show her. Charlotte closed the notebook and went to get dressed. Henry appeared in the doorway at 7:45 in his good clothes, already somewhat rumpled, carrying Pip under one arm. Pip had a small ribbon around his neck, applied by Henry with great seriousness. Henry said, "Pip is coming." "Pip is staying with Mrs. Elton," Eleanor said. Henry looked at Pip. He considered the matter with the practical gravity of someone assessing their options. He handed Pip to Mrs. Elton, who appeared behind him, as if she had known exactly when she would be needed, which she had. James knocked on the door at 8, dressed perfectly, hair brushed with precision, standing with the gravity of someone who understood the day. He looked at Eleanor. "You look very well, Mama," he said. He meant it completely. "Thank you, James," she said. He came and stood beside the dressing table, and she took his hand, and he let her hold it for a moment, which was the closest James came to saying what he felt. At Pemberton Manor, in the vestry of the small country church 2 hours from London, Edmund Pemberton was standing beside Sebastian Ashford, and not being practically useful, but being something more important, which was present. "You look entirely calm," Edmund said. "I am entirely calm," Sebastian said. "I know," Edmund said. "That's what I mean. You've been calm about this for months." Sebastian straightened his cuff, which did not need straightening, and said nothing. Edmund said, "She is remarkable." "Yes," Sebastian said. "Her children are remarkable." "Yes," Sebastian said. "You are going to be happy," Edmund said. Sebastian looked at him. "I know," he said. The church was small and very old, stone and high-roofed, with windows that had been beautiful for 150 years, and intended to continue. Reverend Walter Gibson had known Edmund since his own childhood, and had agreed to officiate with the warm energy of a man who liked a wedding, and particularly liked this one. The guests were perhaps 60, the exact number Eleanor had wanted, which was everyone who mattered, and no one who was merely present. The Duchess Margaret was in the first row. She was wearing deep blue, that was not quite somber, and not quite celebratory, which was exactly her. She looked at the altar with the expression she wore when she had an opinion she was keeping to herself, and was content to keep it there. Cecily was in the second row beside her husband, who was patient and good-natured, and entirely supportive of Cecily's life. Cecily had been calm for the past week, by the active application of willpower, and she was going to be calm through the ceremony, she had promised herself, and she intended to keep that promise until about 3 minutes in. The music began. The congregation stood. Eleanor walked in with James. It had been her idea, and she had told Sebastian simply and without explanation. "I would like James to walk in with me." Sebastian had said of course, and had understood without needing the explanation. James walked beside her with his chin level and his back straight, and his face carrying the serious, wide-open expression he produced only when something mattered enormously, and he was not going to waste it by pretending it did not. Charlotte walked behind with Henry, who had been promised cake at the reception, and had agreed, on this basis, to conduct himself appropriately. He was conducting himself appropriately. He was also looking at everything with the total cataloging attention of someone who intends to remember all of it. Sebastian saw Eleanor at the far end of the aisle. He was completely still for a moment. He stood at the altar, and he watched her come toward him, and he thought about the garden in August, and the library in winter, and a Tuesday morning, with a wicker basket and a dog, and he thought, there she is. He did not look away. She reached him. James stepped back and stood beside Charlotte with the correct solemnity. Henry looked at the stained glass window immediately to his left and was absorbed. Reverend Gibson smiled the smile of a man who had married hundreds of people and still found each one worthwhile. He began. The vows were the old ones, the words that carried the weight of every time they had been said genuinely. Sebastian said his looking at Eleanor. Eleanor said hers looking at him. Neither of them looked anywhere else. Charlotte stood and read. She held her notebook and read 3 stanzas in a clear, steady voice, and what she had written was about the particular courage required to begin again, to choose again, to trust again, not the dramatic courage of catastrophe, but the quieter, harder courage of ordinary life. It was entirely Charlotte. It was entirely true. Several people in the church found they were crying, which they had not expected. Charlotte herself did not cry. She held the notebook very straight, and her chin was very high. Henry watched a bird on the window ledge for most of the poem. Sebastian put the ring on Eleanor's finger. He said the words that were asked of him, in the voice he used for things he meant, and he meant every one. and he said them to her, and only to her. She said her words. She did not look away. The reception at Pemberton Manor was everything Edmund had promised, which was excellent food, a warm house, and the kind of management that was invisible because it was perfect. The grounds were at the last of September's color, the trees turning, and the roses at their final show, and the house was open to the evening air, which was warm for September, as if the month had decided to be generous. The Duchess Margaret danced with James. He was a very serious dancer. He had been practicing in secret for 2 months, a fact that emerged only when Edmund mentioned it to Eleanor the week before, and Eleanor had wept briefly and privately in the garden about it. James danced with complete concentration, not speaking, counting the steps in his head, and the Duchess danced with the same seriousness, because she understood him. When the music ended, she said something to him quietly. James looked at her with the expression he produced only when something had moved him past his considerable self-control. He nodded. Cecily's toast was 9 minutes, and entirely unrehearsed, which meant it was real. She said things about Eleanor that were true and specific, and funny, and tender, and she said them in the particular voice of a woman who had watched her closest friend build herself back up from nothing, and was proud to have been present for it. She ended by saying she had known from the moment Eleanor came home from Pemberton in August, with her shoes damp from the garden path, and a different expression than she had left with, that something important had changed, and that she was glad. She sat down and cried into her handkerchief, and then recovered and ate cake. Several people mentioned Sylvia Crane. No one did. The evening was complete without it. At 9 o'clock Henry began to wind down. He had eaten considerably more cake than was technically sanctioned, had danced twice with Caroline Pemberton, who had lifted him to the right height, and had chased Pip briefly through the East Garden before Alfred had redirected them both with the patient firmness of someone who had understood his new duties. Now Henry was at the table in the quiet sitting room, with his eyes at half-mast, the particular altitude that meant 20 minutes at most. Sebastian saw him. He crossed the room and sat down beside him without making a production of it. Henry leaned against Sebastian's side with the complete, unquestioned trust of someone who has made a decision about a person and sees no reason to revisit it. Within 15 minutes, Henry was asleep against Sebastian's shoulder. Sebastian stayed exactly where he was. He was in conversation with people who came to find him throughout the later part of the evening, talking about the estate, and about Parliament, and about Edmund's plans for the spring, and he did all of it, with Henry's weight against his side, and the warmth of a small sleeping person against his shoulder, and he did not move. He could have moved Henry to the sofa. He did not. When people looked at his face during those hours, they found on it something that was completely still and very full. The expression of someone who has arrived at a place he did not know he was looking for, and is not going to move. Eleanor saw it from across the room. She stood near the window and watched Sebastian in the chair with Henry asleep against him, one arm free to gesture gently in conversation, so as not to wake the boy, and she held what she was seeing in her chest carefully, the way you hold the things that are going to matter for the rest of your life. Cecily appeared beside her. She looked at the same thing for a moment. She said nothing, which was the most significant thing Cecily had ever said. Late in the evening, the guests had settled into the easy, winding down hours. Henry had been carried by Sebastian to a proper bed inside, and arranged with his blankets, and Sebastian had stood for a moment in the doorway, before returning to the reception. Charlotte was asleep in a chair, with her notebook in her lap. James was talking with Edmund about the Pemberton estate drainage, which would have surprised most people, and surprised neither Edmund nor Sebastian at all. Eleanor and Sebastian found the terrace. The same stone balustrade overlooking the lower garden. The evening air smelled of late roses, and turned earth and apples from the old tree below, which was at its fullest in September, heavy, leaning at its familiar angle to the right, entirely itself, as it had been for 40 years. He reached for her hand, and she gave it to him without thinking. She said, "Same garden." He said, "Same garden." She looked at the apple tree for a moment. The lanterns in the garden had burned low, and the tree was mostly dark below them, only its shape visible against the sky. She said, "I was afraid." He said, "I know." She said, "I am not afraid now." He said, "I know." She looked at him. He was looking at the garden. After a moment he looked at her. She said, "You are very calm for a man who has made a significant life decision today." He said, I have been calm about it for months. The decision was made some time ago. I was only waiting for the right Tuesday. She said, the right Tuesday. He said, it was a very good Tuesday. She laughed. The full, unguarded, entirely real laugh. The one that had nothing held back in it, no management, no distance, no careful layer of composure between herself and the sound. It went up into the September night, and he watched it happen, and thought, there it is. There is the thing I came back into the world for. There is the thing I sat in a garden in August for without knowing it, and crossed a ballroom for, and put 5 letters in a drawer for, and stood on a front step one Tuesday morning for. He did not say any of this. He stood beside her at the balustrade, in the warm evening dark, and held her hand, and looked at the old lopsided apple tree below them, heavy with September fruit, standing as it had always stood, a little crooked, a little worn. Everything it should not have survived having passed through it, still here, still producing, still entirely and determinedly itself. From inside the open terrace door, high and clear and entirely certain, they heard Henry's voice say, "Where is Pip?" They said it at the same moment, inside. She looked at him. He looked at her. The evening was warm and still, and the garden smelled of the last of summer going into autumn, and the stars overhead were the particular clear stars of a September night that has decided to be extraordinary, and the music from inside was slow and golden, and reaching them at the right distance to be beautiful. It was a very good Tuesday, she said. He held her hand and looked at the apple tree and thought, yes, it was.